When we think of Europe, what comes to mind? Probably a map, right? A collection of stable, ancient countries. But what if I told you that the idea of Europe wasn't some grand, peaceful design? What if it was actually forged in fire, hammered into shape over centuries of crisis, conflict, and just radical transformation? Well, that's what we're going to dive into. Let's explore how this continent was really made.
You see, the story of Europe doesn't start with a map at all. It starts with a conflict. Way back around 400 BC, the Greek physician Hippocrates drew this really sharp line in the sand between us and them. On one side, he said, you have Europeans, brave, free. On the other, Asiatics, which for him meant the Persian Empire, who he saw as cultured, sure, but way too passive. Now, this wasn't some neutral geographical statement. It was a cultural one, forged in the heat of war. It's the very first faint outline of a European identity, and it was defined by what it was not.
So that's the big question, isn't it? How does a simple us versus them idea, born out of a specific war, grow into a whole civilization? That's the journey we're on today. It's a story of falling empires, rising faiths, and a continent basically being forced to reinvent itself over and over again for the next 1,000 years. All right, so our story really kicks off in the rubble of the Roman Empire. As Rome starts to crumble, it leaves this massive power vacuum. And into that void rush three huge new forces that are going to shape everything. The Christian faith, which offered a new kind of unity, the fierce warrior culture of the Germanic tribes, and just massive waves of migrants who are literally redrawing the map of the continent.
And let's be clear, this wasn't some orderly transition. No way. It was a chaotic wandering of peoples that completely upended the old world. Over several centuries, you've got Germanic tribes setting up brand new kingdoms on the ashes of old Roman provinces, while Slavic peoples are pushing west. The old world was being completely overwritten, creating this volatile, vibrant, and totally new mosaic of cultures.
This political upheaval was mirrored by an absolutely profound cultural revolution. Think about who the hero of the age was. It's no longer the Roman emperor, with his power coming from legions and conquest. The new ideal, the new hero, is the Christian saint, whose power came from faith, from sacrifice. This is a fundamental shift in what society valued. The very definition of power was being rewritten from the ground up.
And here is where we see this fusion in action. You couldn't just get rid of the fierce Germanic warrior. That culture was too strong, so it had to be integrated. The old ritual of just giving a warrior his weapons was slowly Christianized. First, the church added its blessing. Then a whole night of religious vigil was added. The warrior was reborn as the knight, a perfect symbol of this new hybrid civilization, serving both his Lord and his God.
So, after a few hundred years of fragmentation, the fire in the forge gets a whole lot hotter. We're now in the high Middle Ages, and new forces are starting to accelerate Europe's transformation. We're talking bustling cities, trade networks that span the continent, and a revolutionary new institution, the university.
You know, the medieval city was a total paradox. On the one hand, you had people like the monk Philippe de Harvingt, who saw cities like Paris as a new Jerusalem, these shining beacons of learning, progress, and civilization. But then you had influential figures like St. Bernard, who saw them as a new Babel, just chaotic, worldly places full of sin and temptation. This tension, this pull between the sacred and the secular, really defined this urban explosion.
And what was fueling all this urban growth? Well, a full-blown commercial revolution. You had these incredible international markets, like the champagne fairs in France. You had new currency spreading across the continent. And you had the rise of written contracts, which sounds boring but was a huge deal. All of this started weaving the continent together. For the very first time, you could start to see the faint outlines of an interconnected European economy.
But you know, maybe the most radical creation in this entire era was something completely new to the world, the university. And this wasn't just a school, it was a self-governing community of scholars, a protected space designed specifically for one thing, the pursuit of knowledge through organized critical debate. A real game changer.
And this quote from the philosopher Peter Abelard, it just perfectly nails the radical new spirit of these universities. It was a spirit built on logic, on reason, and even on doubt. The idea that truth isn't something you just receive from on high, but something you find through relentless questioning, well, that became an absolute cornerstone of the European intellectual tradition, one we're still living with today.
But this incredible period of explosive growth, well, it couldn't last. The 14th century brought unimaginable crisis. We're talking plague, famine, and constant, brutal warfare. This was the tempering of the metal, a savage process of heating and hammering that hardened Europe's identity, often in some of the most terrifying ways imaginable.
Remember, you will die. This phrase basically became the motto of the age. The Black Death wiped out as much as half the population. I mean, can you even imagine? Death wasn't some abstract concept anymore. It was a daily, visceral reality for everyone. And this obsession with mortality, it just saturated European art, religion, and culture, creating a much, much darker, more anxious worldview.
And in this climate of fear, Europe began to define itself more sharply by identifying its internal enemies. You can actually see the horrifying construction of an architecture of persecution. It started with forcing Jewish people to wear identifying symbols. It escalated with the creation of the Inquisition to hunt heretics. And then it was literally codified in manuals like the Hammer of Witches, which laid out a step-by-step blueprint for brutal witch hunts. Europe was deciding who belonged and who did not.
This era also saw a complete transformation in the very idea of justice. The Inquisition pioneered a new method, one that wasn't focused on public evidence, but on getting a private confession. By making the confession the ultimate goal, often through intense interrogation, the state and the church gained this incredibly powerful new tool for social control. It was a way to peer directly into the minds and souls of their subjects.
So out of this period of intense crisis, the final form of medieval Europe began to solidify. That vague concept of a kingdom or a people started to sharpen into something we'd recognize a little more easily today, the early idea of a nation.
But we have to be really careful with our words here. When a medieval student at the University of Paris said he belonged to the Anglo-German nation, he wasn't talking about a country, not at all. He just meant he was part of the student group that came from that general region. The word natio just meant place of origin. The idea of a sovereign nation-state was still a long, long way off.
So what was it that forged those vague origins into sharp national identities? War. The relentless, generations-long conflict of the 100 Years' War acted like the forge's hammer. It forced people to stop thinking of themselves as belonging to a local lord and start seeing themselves as either English or French. And when England officially dropped the French language from its court, that wasn't just a political move, it was a declaration of a separate, unique identity, one that had been hardened in the crucible of war.
So in the end, the idea of Europe wasn't something you could just find on a map. It was truly forged in fire. It was hammered into shape by fallen empires, by new faiths, by booming cities, and by centuries of war. It's never been a finished project, which of course leaves us with one final big question. If those were the forces that forged Europe in the past, what forces are forging it today?